Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another week. Glad that you're here. For this video, I want to talk about the essay that we read last time, "Should Writers Use Their Own English" by Vershawn Young. I was happy with the discussion. I did read through all the posts. I responded to a few of them. One thing I found last semester is that with the discussions that I love reading all of your replies and I would love to respond to all of them, but it would take me like literally hours to respond to like 15 of those. So I just can't go too overboard with that, or it's just going to make me not productive with the class. So I'm probably every time going to respond to three, four, five, maybe something like that. Um, and then sometimes I'll also do a video like this, kind of recapping our discussion and maybe emphasizing a few other points. But good work with that is what I wanted to say. Okay, so let's get into this. I like this essay. I think it's fun. I hope that it was unexpected and maybe more interesting for that. Obviously, the style is the first thing I want to talk about. So this essay is written using a couple of different dialects, right? And the reason I like to start with this essay, I always start my composition classes with this, is because the fundamental question of any writing class is going to be what is good writing? What counts as good writing? What does good writing look like? What does it feel like to read good writing? And I think for a lot of English classes, the answer to what is good writing is comes down to a list of rules or a checklist or something like that. It's what it means to write good. It means to put your commas in the right place and have the right capital letters and no run-on sentences. And as long as you do those things, that's good writing. And I think when we take that approach that of course teachers have forced on you, we put to the back of our mind like how convincing it actually is, how engaging an essay actually is. Is it going to really persuade the reader, or is it just kind of like some stale rehashing of stuff? How effective is it? Is it interesting? Is it fun to read? I think that those things are really important. The reason I like to start with this essay is because so many English classes emphasize grammar as like the number one priority for good writing. As long as your sentence structure is there, like I said, your commas are in the right place, that's good writing. You get an A now. And I really just think that this is a mistake. And I think that it's ultimately harmful for writing in college and beyond, because when it comes to college writing, and for me when I teach this class, the more important thing is the argument is persuasive, the organization of the paragraphs, the thesis, things like that to me are so much more important than grammar. So that's one of the reasons that I like to start with this. So let's get into some of the things that Young actually talks about here. And I saw some people saying that they found the style annoying, but I wonder how much of it is just that it's unexpected. And I do this on purpose because in the last video, if you actually watched all the way to the end, I did set this essay up as telling you that it's from an academic journal and it's written by a doctor, and all these kinds of things. So I do that on purpose because of what Young is really asking for here, and maybe this gets right to his thesis. That I see on page 111, that we need to expand what counts as good writing and also like good academic writing. I took his thesis to be, and I think somebody pointed this out. I should have wrote down who, but I think somebody kind of highlighted this quote in the discussion. And to me, this is his thesis. It's on page 111, the last sentence of that middle paragraph. He says, "And that's my exact argument," which there you go. That should tell you his thesis is coming, right? And that's my argument, that we all should know everybody's dialect, at least as many as we can, and be open to the mix of them in oral and written communication. So I think it's important to really nail down on this thesis, right? Because I see students a lot when I teach this kind of maybe take Young's point in the wrong way. Like sometimes because he's saying, oh well, standard English is bad and wrong, and we'll talk about why he thinks that. But because he thinks that he's saying, oh, whatever you do is fine. If you want to make up your own language like we did when we were kids, right? Where you whatever you put a certain syllable in the middle of the words or change the letters around or something. that, that's fine, because that's your language. And I don't think that's what he's saying. If we look here, we should all know everybody's dialect, at least as many as we can. So dialect is not like, if I just made up my own language and started talking that way and no one else understood it, that would not be a dialect, that would just be a made up language. A dialect has to actually be in use by people. So that's kind of Jung's really big thing, is that he wants the starting point for when we think about language and what it should look like and what is good writing and stuff, that the starting point should be language as it's actually used by real people in their real lives, right? And so yeah, that's what I think he says. We should all know everybody's dialect, at least as many as we can. So it's also not expecting that we should know every single one in its entirety, but just that we should learn as many as we're able to. And I think one thing here, and he says this somewhere else, how we actually know a lot more dialects than we think that we do. Like, I think we view ourselves as, oh, I speak standard English, right? Uh, or maybe like whatever. But I think we all speak a lot more dialects. For some people, there's like cultural dialects, right? For instance, like for me, with my family is Italian, and like the way that they talk about Italian food, the pronunciations and the words they use, I think you could view that as kind of like a dialect. I think you could view the way people like talk about video games as a dialect. I think you could view the way that you talk to your friends versus how you talk to your parents. I think we could almost view those as different dialects because there's just like different words that we use based on the situation that we're in. So I think Young wants to say, like, we already know a lot of dialects, so like learn as many as you can and be open to them being mixed. It's not that you can only use dialect and you have to write exactly like Young does all the time, or else that's bad. That's not what he's saying. He doesn't think everyone should write like him. This is just how he writes because of his background, who he is, right? So, and the other thing is that he also has standard English in this essay, right? There are certain sentences I could point out to. I think one of them I'm going to read in a minute about standard language ideology. But there are sentences in here that don't have any dialect. They would read, if you took them out, just like standard English. So it's not that it's like you should only speak in whatever dialect, but it's just that we should be able to mix all of these because it like helps us to be more convincing, which is supposed to be the point of an essay, right? But also it makes it more interesting for the reader, and it might be able to bring in certain audiences that it might not otherwise. But like professors and even very educated people with doctorates and stuff still speak in dialects, like all the time. I think that's kind of his point, that like speaking in dialects is something like fundamental to us. Okay, so that's his thesis. And when he puts it that way, I think it is kind of hard to argue with him on that. So the reason that like he's giving this thesis in the context of arguing against this guy Fish, right? And the main thing that he's arguing against is the idea of standard language ideology that Fish seems to be interested in. So this is on page 111. We kind of get a definition here of standard language ideology that I want to look at. It's the first paragraph of 111. He says, standard language ideology is the belief that there is one set of dominant language rules that stem from a single dominant discourse like standard English that all writers and speakers of English must conform to in order to communicate effectively. So I think the interesting word here, standard language, that makes enough sense, right? But standard language ideology. Why does he say ideology? What does that mean? This is a word that's going to come up in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk more about this word. But I think the way he's using it here, the way to understand it, he says standard language ideology is the belief that there's one set of dominant language rules. So that's the thing about this, is that it's like a belief in there being one correct version of English, right? And when you start to think about it this way, it's kind of strange, right? It's almost like a theological belief, like that there's this one perfect thing that is standard English, and anything that deviates from it is just wrong, because it's just like it implies that standard language is inherently good, first of all, right? That's the best it could be, and also that it's kind of timeless. It makes it seem like it's always been there. Well, that's the standard, and that is not subject to history or changes or anything like that. When the actual fact of the matter is that what's been considered standard English, like or standard language, that concept, the idea that there's a right and a wrong way to write something, has only been around really for a couple of hundred years. I think I mentioned in the discussion that the first dictionaries were being written in like the 1600s, which, that might seem like a long time ago, but that's really not a long time ago when you consider like how long language and writing have been in use. So this concept that there should be some kind of system that tells you this is right and this is wrong, it's really a very modern way of thinking about it. Like if you read stuff, I remember I took a course in colonial American literature, and I had to read I think it was the diary or something of one of these explorers, right? Like John Smith, maybe one of these explorers to America in like the what is it? I don't know, late 1500s, 1600s. And when you actually look at this stuff, you see that there's all kinds of unconventional spellings. They do like swift with an e at the end, or shop with two p's and an e at the end, and it was just not really like policed in the way that it currently is. So I think that's one thing, that this belief in standard ideology, that if we actually look at the history, right, if we actually look at like the material ways that language has changed and progressed over time, we realize that there wasn't always even the idea of there being a standard, and what has been the standard has also changed a lot over time. Like you always hear about this, like you'll see some kind of social media thing that like the dictionary just added the term Google, like to Google something. They added that to the dictionary. And it's like, okay, so is it now a word because it's in the dictionary? Or was it a word because people were using it and other people knew what they meant? You know, like the actual evolution of language takes place too fast for dictionaries to like legislate it top down. And this gets to something else I want to talk about, which is his kind of the distinction between a descriptive view of language and a prescriptive view of language. I was talking about this before with Young, where he has the descriptive view, meaning you start from how people actually use language, and then you say, and then whatever, you can make a dictionary just based on observing, basically. Or the prescriptive view would be, well, we'll come up with what the correct thing is, and then we'll tell everyone to do that, kind of from the top down. So Young is definitely on the descriptive side of that. Okay, but with standard language ideology, the reason that this is a real problem, so the reason that he, I think, sees this as such a big deal, kind of, and like worth writing, this whole essay about it, because you might say, oh, okay, well, standard language, like, okay, maybe it's kind of bullshit because the standards have changed and stuff, and there's never just been one standard, really. But, like, who cares, right? So I think the way that he answers that question is by connecting standard language ideology to what he calls linguistic prejudice. So he says this on the first page. He talks about this kind of idea of linguistic prejudice by saying, talking about when folks don't get no jobs or get fired or whatever because they talk or write Asian or black or with an Appalachian accent or sound like whatever ain't the status quo. So this is kind of, I think, like the more real world, like consequential idea of this is his point that I think is correct, that like when you believe in a standard language, anyone who doesn't fit into that is viewed as like less than, right? Or viewed as like not as good or uneducated or dumb. Or whatever, and that the harm in that is not just making those people feel bad; it's that those people then are viewed as not necessarily not like qualified for good jobs or jobs that make a decent amount of money or positions of power. you know so that is kind of like the real world thing, and we all know this is true, because if you go to a job interview, how are you going to talk? Like what do your family members tell you? Like, what are they going to tell you before you go to a job interview about how you need to talk and stuff, right? And even I do this, even though I agree with Vershawn Young. When I went to job interviews, yeah, I definitely was, on my standard English, right? So yeah, that's kind of like the real world consequence of this, and this gets to the question I was asking you guys about how could like ideas about language contribute to the status quo. Status quo being understood as kind of the general organization of society with politics and economics, who's on the top and who's on the bottom, right? And I think a lot of people kind of got to this, but to me, the answer to that is, well, if you can speak standard English, you kind of are able to, stay towards the top or get to the top or whatever, or you just have a leg up, right? It's not that speaking standard English makes it 100% that you're going to be rich or something. It's just that like you kind of have a leg up, right? You're a little bit ahead compared to other people. Um, and that, yeah, if you can't speak standard English, you're going to be behind, and you're not going to make it past that job interview, right? If you even get it. And kind of the messed up part of this is to think about how much it's related to just like where you're born and who your parents are and how they talk. Because, when do you really start going to school? When you're like 4 or 5 or something? For most people, by that time, I think like our initial stage of like language acquisition has already started. People start talking when they're what I don't even know, like 1.5 or 2 or something. So like before you even go to school, based on how your family talks, either they talk standard English or they talk some other way, and through no fault of your own, just based on where you were born, who your parents are, there's one of these dialects is just viewed as correct and one isn't. And that's really another point that I think Young is trying to make to us is that standard English, it's not that no one should ever use it, that we should abolish it, right? It's that we shouldn't give it the kind of central place where anything that deviates from that is wrong, that it doesn't need to be kind of like the sun, in the universe of or the solar system of language where every other dialect is like a planet around the sun. So what he's really trying to do, I think, is kind of decenter standard English and make it, standard English is just as good as the way that he writes, which he refers to as Black English, which is just as good as Appalachian English, so yeah, I think he really which is just as good as whatever, like gamer dialect or something. So I think what he's trying to do really is just not have there be like a value system to the different dialects, to basically just say like, oh, they're all just different, and that's fine. Like that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I wanted to address one of the concerns that I think a lot of people had that were brought up in the discussion, which is the idea that it would just be hard to understand, right? That like people wouldn't really understand you. And I think he even kind of brings this up at one point. So yeah, okay. On the idea of like it'd be hard to understand people speaking dialects. First of all, like I said before, I think we already speak a bunch of dialects ourselves. The other thing is like that I always bring up on this. Uh, okay, if dialects are hard to understand, a thing I would pose against that is like, what is the most popular, or who is the most popular music artist right now? Like in America, what musician is selling the most, what, downloads? I don't even know if they sell anymore. But who's like the most successful? I don't know if this is still true, but I think it's probably somebody like Drake or yeah, I don't know, probably somebody similar to Drake, right? Or maybe him still, I don't know. But whatever your answer to that would be, does that person speak in standard English? Like are Drake's songs in standard English? No, of course not. Some of it is maybe standard English, but it's also a bunch of other dialects. And even though it uses dialects, it's still able to be something that hundreds of millions of people listen to and more or less understand. Even like white kids in the suburbs listen to this rap music and then they learn the dialect, right? When you first learn it, or I mean, if you're somebody like me, the first time I listened to like a 50 Cent song and he was talking about, like a gat or something, like I didn't know what that was, but then you learn, right? Because you're like, oh, this music is cool. And then you hear words you don't know and then you learn those words. And I think that's really all that Young is asking for, is that when we hear a word that we don't know, we don't be like, no, you can't use that word, get it out of here. That instead we're like, oh, what does that word mean? Oh, really? That's what it means? Cool. Now I know something else. And I think that's what he means by learning everyone's dialect, at least as many as we can. So the question beyond that becomes, okay, well, sure, but maybe it's okay to have different dialects. But I think where there's some tension sometimes is like, well, should that be okay in school or should that be okay at work? And I think a lot of this will come down to people will appeal to like, well, it's not professional, right? It's not proper or something like that. So I think just like we were looking at standard English and saying, well, where does this come from? How did this develop? We can do the same things about ideas of professionalism and ideas of properness and correctness, right? Where do they come from? These things were not handed down by God, right? It's not some law of nature that like this shirt's professional, but a different one isn't. So where did this come from? And I think once we start looking at that, one thing that Vershawn Young brings up is the idea that there's certain things that today are like fine or professional, they're like fine to wear at the office or whatever, that didn't used to be. One thing that he mentions is people having braided hair, or like black people wearing their hair in like a natural way, that in like the 80s that used to be unprofessional, you know, or like you wouldn't get hired or you wouldn't get the job interview, or tattoos I think are similar. Like in the 80s or whatever, if you got a tattoo, it was like, oh, I guess you don't need a job. But now I think those things are fine, right? Like my sister has a tattoo and she like works, you know, selling stuff in an office. Um, so I think we can see that what counts as professional does change over the time. So then the question becomes, well, can this happen with language in this way too? And I mean, if other things have changed, I don't know. Why not? What would it take? I don't know. Maybe the next generation of bosses or whatever would just have to kind of view it that way, or the people who are customers for this stuff would have to kind of view it that way. All right, I know I've gone long with this video. The last thing I want to bring up is the way that he connects all of this to race, right? Because, and I think he's right about this, because a lot of dialects are connected to one race or another, you know? Like he calls the way he talks, he refers to as Black English. And different accents, right, from people who you know, are of different ethnicities or cultures. And I think an interesting point on this is kind of like which dialects are like acceptable and which ones aren't, right? Uh, would it ever be considered unprofessional to like talk in an English accent at work? You know, if you were just from London and you came to work in America and that's just how you talk, would that be viewed as unprofessional? Similarly, southern, like a southern dialect. If you were from, you know, Alabama and you moved to the north and were trying to work in an office, would that be viewed as unprofessional? I don't know, but would it be viewed in the same way that the way Vershawn Young talks would be viewed as unprofessional? Definitely not. Would it be viewed as unprofessional the same way like having a Spanish accent would be viewed as unprofessional? Definitely not. So I think he is kind of right to point to race as a factor. Of course, things like class are also a factor. He talks about like an Appalachian accent that's usually associated with, you know, being like a hillbilly or something. So I think there's certain like class vectors with this as well. I'm just looking for the part where he talks about like George W. Bush, right? Because he says that standard language ideology also insists that like white men can like get away with not having perfect standard English while people of other races can't, right? And he talks about how George Bush was known for having like bad grammar and bad rhetoric and stuff, but you know could still be president. And I think this essay was written before that, but I think obviously he was insane about Donald Trump. I think people liked him, you know, because he used non-standard English and stuff like that. So I think his point is that like you know people of color would not be able to do that in the same way. So there's like a weird way that race gets mixed in with this also. All right, I've talked long enough, but really I just wanted to read this essay to just kind of set the tone for the course and really just to give you guys all, because I agree with Young about this stuff, right? I would be interested to see all you guys try to write maybe with some of the dialects you use at home or with your friends or whatever. Because ultimately, our goal is to write the best, most convincing essay we can. And to me, that's much less about having your commas in the right place than it is about, you know, saying what you mean to say in a way that's convincing to the audience and having it being interesting. Like, it's important that an essay is interesting. If it's not interesting, you're not going to convince anyone, you know? So I would encourage you guys to try to write like this if you want, not the same way Young writes, but your own way, right? And I think also with this being, you know, kind of a introductory writing course, I think it's important too that we try to find a way to write more like ourselves, you know, because I think like the whole thing of trying to write in this like fancy academic way that we think the teachers want, I think when we try to write like that, it ends up not being as convincing or interesting of an essay, you know, and ultimately not as good of an essay. So yeah, I just kind of want us to have our priorities where like grammar and stuff, not number one, you know, like sure, it's still on the list, but it's number like 20 below things like argument, thesis, persuasiveness, organization, quotes, all those things. All right. I went way too long in this. I'm sorry. I'll try to make it shorter next time. I'll see you later.